In the NBA, people talk about myths, about talents that never made it, about those names that survive more for what they could have been than for what they really did. And among all those ghosts, there is one that rises higher than anyone else: Demetrius "Hook" Mitchell, a player barely 1.75 meters tall who, according to Gary Payton and Jason Kidd, was better than them when they were teenagers. Yes, better than a future glove, and better than a point guard who dominated the 2000s. But Hook never played in the NBA. His stage was another: the playgrounds of Oakland, the improvised neighborhood courts, and later, the prisons of California. There behind bars, while others lost hope, he would leap over rivals and throw down dunks that didn't even seem possible on television. How can it be that a man everyone called the next big star ended up being a legend without a ring, without a contract, without an official photo? What force greater than talent took him straight from NBA dreams to the shadows of a cell? This is the story of the player who dominated the NBA from prison. To understand Hook, you first have to understand where he grew up. Oakland in the 1980s wasn't just a tough neighborhood, it was an invisible cage. In Campbell Village, a public housing complex in the west of the city, life was a maze of violence, drugs, and state neglect. There, kids didn't dream of becoming doctors or lawyers. The menu was much more limited: crack or basketball. Hook was born in 1968, just as crack was beginning to wipe out entire families like a silent virus. His mother and father were addicts, going in and out of jail as if they were train stations. From a young age, he saw scenes no child should ever see: his mom trying different drugs in the kitchen, his dad absent or locked up, his uncles and cousins handing him marijuana and cocaine as if they were candy. By 10, he was smoking marijuana every morning. By 12, he had already tried cocaine. In that context, growing up was an extreme sport. The neighborhood was designed to consume you. On the corners, there were dealers. In the houses, there were users, and on the streets, the police patrolled like an occupying army. Hook would step out of his house and see two paths: the gang or the orange ball. Many chose the first. He, at least for a while, chose the second. But Campbell Village didn't let you go easily. If you weren't on the court, you were in the smoke. If you weren't playing, you were running from someone or for someone. It was an ecosystem where the rules of the street weighed more than those of the school, and a kid like Hook, skinny, electric, with the talent to fly, seemed destined to shine. But from the very beginning, the setting surrounded him like a trap. Every leap upward on the court had a slippery floor waiting for him on the way down. If the neighborhood was a trap, Hook's house was a minefield. His childhood was marked by absolute disorder: a father in prison, a mother caught in drugs, and a boy searching for affection in the middle of the smoke. There were no schedules, no rules, no adult to wake him up early for school or to hug him when he came back with good grades. In that chaos, Hook went from hand to hand. Sometimes he slept in relatives' houses, other times he ended up crashing in homes where crack was common currency. The closest thing to stability he found was with his grandmother, who was raising 10 grandchildren on her own as best she could. But even there, the lack of resources and time meant that Hook grew up almost without guidance. He was just one more in an overwhelmed family. The result was a boy who learned to survive however he could. His childhood wasn't just occasional contact with drugs. It was a saturated environment where substances were within arm's reach, almost part of daily routine. And the most disturbing part is that many times those substances came from his own inner circle. Uncles, cousins, even his immediate family offered him drugs as if it were something normal. They didn't do it to harm him, they did it because they were also drowning, and in that twisted logic, sharing was a way of caring. Hook remembers it with rawness. He said he felt like a kid trapped between two worlds. On one side, the basketball, on the other, the bottle and the white bag. That double life began far too early, and it eroded any chance of order, because even when he shone on the court, when he came back home, he faced the same murky scene, with the certainty that no one was saving him. The wound wasn't just social, it was intimate. It wasn't about growing up in a tough neighborhood, it was about growing up without a real home, without an adult to pull him out of that wheel, and that absence would mark everything that came after. In the middle of the chaos, Hook found an unexpected lifeline: the Payton family. Gary Payton, who would later be known as the Glove, grew up with him in Oakland and saw him almost like a younger brother. For Hook, the Payton household was like another planet. There were schedules, rules, hot meals, and above all, a present father who set boundaries, everything he never had in his own home. More than once, Hook slept on the floor of Gary's room, or literally under his bed. He did it because at his own house, there was no space, no peace, no safety. That simple difference, a stable roof, a plate of food, someone telling you tomorrow you have to get up early, was enough to show him that life could be something else. The problem was that this refuge couldn't be permanent. Antonio Davis, another future NBA player, also remembers having him at his house at some point. His friends' mothers would let him stay as if everyone knew that Hook had nowhere else to land. He was the talented kid everyone wanted on the court, but no one could fully save off of it. The paradox is that while his own relatives brought him closer to drugs, the families of his teammates tried to bring him closer to normality. And between those two worlds, Hook took refuge in the only thing he could control, the ball. With it, everything made sense. The hours of chaos disappeared when the ball bounced on the asphalt, and he could prove that, at just 1.75 meters, he could soar above anyone. That contrast is brutal. At home, smoke and loneliness. On the court, applause and admiration. And that gap between what he was inside and what he could be outside would mark his destiny forever. On the street, Hook was a spectacle. He stood just 1.75 meters tall, but jumped as if he had wings. His dunks were impossible to ignore. 360 spins in the air, throwing it down over much taller opponents, leaping over parked cars or motorcycles in the middle of an exhibition. He would even have someone sit in a chair with the crowd holding its breath and soar right over them as if it were nothing. People didn't go to the court to watch a game, they went to watch Hook. When the rumor spread that he was going to play, Oakland's playgrounds turned into improvised arenas, stands filled with neighbors, music blasting, crowds packed in just to witness what new trick he would pull out of his hat. It didn't matter if Jason Kidd, Gary Payton, or Antonio Davis were on the other side. Hook was the main attraction. What's incredible is that his dominance wasn't a myth inflated over time. Future NBA players themselves said it plainly. Hook was better than them. He had a natural talent you didn't see every day, and there lay the brutal contrast. While his friends began building professional careers, he seemed like a circus artist condemned to repeat his show in the same neighborhood forever. His name began to spread like an urban legend. The kid from Oakland who could jump higher than anyone, who at 1.75 meters seemed to defy physics. For many, he was living proof that basketball doesn't always reward the greatest talent, but the one who manages to escape his own demons. On the playgrounds, Hook was king. The problem was that his kingdom had no crowns or million-dollar contracts, only fleeting applause and the certainty that when the crowd went home, he returned to the same emptiness. Hook's talent was so great it seemed impossible that anything could stop him. On the court, there was no rival capable of containing him. He jumped, he floated, he finished, and even the players who would later become NBA stars looked at him with respect. But he didn't need a Gary Payton or a Jason Kidd in front of him to complicate his life. The real enemy was inside him. While his friends from Oakland were receiving letters from universities, athletic scholarships, and a push toward a secured future, Hook was left behind. Not because he lacked the level. On the contrary, everyone knew he was the most talented. The problem was that he could never sustain the basics: grades at school, daily consistency, the simple act of following a schedule. For him, the day began and ended without a plan, without order, as if talent alone were enough to cover all the cracks. His academic record was a continuous collapse. He never finished high school, and with that gap, every attempt to play at a higher level crashed against the same wall. He didn't have the minimum grades required to enter the college leagues. He passed briefly through Merritt College, then Contra Costa, later Cal State Hayward, but nothing stuck. There was always an excuse, a problem, or directly a relapse. He shone on the court, but off of it he fell apart. And it wasn't just school. Hook showed up high to practices, drank before games, self-destructed in the very place where he needed to grow. That sabotage was double-edged. On one hand, institutions closed the door on him for not meeting requirements. On the other, his own habit stopped him even when he managed to slip through. No coach or program could fix a disorder that came from the root. While Jason Kidd, Gary Payton, and Antonio Davis climbed toward the NBA, Hook remained stuck in a much smaller circle. Minor leagues, neighborhood tournaments, dunk contests on the playgrounds. He had the skill to compete with anyone, but not the stability to sustain it. It was like having a Formula One engine mounted on a car with no brakes or steering wheel. The paradox is cruel. He was better than many who made it to the league, but he could never sustain the invisible part of the game. The part that doesn't show up in highlights or in stats, but that defines careers. Discipline, studying, long-term sacrifice. While his peers built resumes, he burned himself out in parties, alleyways, and excess. The kid who could dunk over a car, who drew crowds in Oakland, couldn't pass a math test. And in that gap between the spectacular and the everyday, his future leaked away until he was left with no real path to the NBA. In every player's life, there are moments that define their career. And for Hook, one of those moments came in Sacramento in the mid-90s. The opportunity came from old friends. Brian Shaw and Gary Payton convinced him to take part in a dunk contest during a summer game at the Arco Arena. The stage couldn't have been better, a packed stadium with more than 10,000 people, NBA stars sitting courtside, and an announcer who introduced him as if he were a superhero. The expectations were cosmic. The host introduced him by listing his titles in street tournaments, his victories in local dunk contests, his reputation as a living legend in Oakland. The crowd was ready to see magic, to witness live the man everyone talked about in the playgrounds, the player who, at just 1.75 meters, seemed capable of defying gravity, but what followed was a completely different show. When Hook entered the arena, he didn't do so as an athlete ready for glory, but as a man defeated before he even began. Red eyes, heavy body, disheveled clothes, Peyton looked at him from the bench and knew immediately Hook was high. The show turned into tragedy. He tried his first dunk and missed. The second too. The third was worse. He kept trying again and again like a boxer who can't get back on his feet until he had racked up 14 failed attempts. The murmur of the crowd shifted from expectation to bewilderment and from bewilderment to discomfort. The 10,000 witnesses who had come to see a miracle were watching a collapse. The NBA stars sitting courtside exchanged incredulous looks. Some couldn't believe this was the player everyone had been talking about. The tension finally ended when the announcer, with a resigned voice, cut the torture short with a blunt phrase, "Today is not the Hookster's day." And just like that, in a matter of minutes, what should have been the great confirmation of his legend turned into a public humiliation. Hook pulled his cap down, lowered his head, and walked off the court in silence. There were no cheers, no ovations, only an uncomfortable emptiness. For Oakland, he would remain the king of the asphalt. But in Sacramento, in front of thousands, the legend had shattered into pieces. If Sacramento had been a public wound, what came next was a much more intimate cut, and perhaps more painful. Brian Shaw, who had known him since childhood, still had faith in him. He had seen his talent 1,000 times and was convinced that Hook deserved another chance. That's why he invited him to his basketball camp, a space where kids of all ages learned fundamentals, discipline, and dreamed of following in their idol's footsteps. Shaw wanted Hook to be the attraction, to show his impossible dunks, to inspire the kids, to prove to them that from Oakland you could go far. At first, everything seemed to work. The kids looked at him wide-eyed, impressed by his athletic ability. Hook made them laugh, motivated them, showed them tricks that seemed straight out of a video game. For a few hours, he recovered the aura of the neighborhood hero. But behind the scenes, something didn't add up. Shaw began to notice strange movements. Hook often slipped out through a side door, disappeared longer than normal, came back with nervous gestures. The truth revealed itself at the end of the shift. Outside, behind a dumpster, Shaw found several official camp jerseys and basketballs hidden. When he confronted him, Hook first tried to downplay it, but when he saw his friend's face, he broke down. With tears in his eyes, he said he hadn't meant any harm, that he wanted to take the jerseys to his grandmother, that he wasn't trying to steal, but to share. It was a fragile explanation, almost childish, but also sincere in its desperation. Shaw listened, but the disappointment was too great. He paid him for the day, let him keep the jerseys, and told him not to come back. It was a gesture of, "I love you, but this is as far as we go." That was the real break. It wasn't a public humiliation in front of 10,000 people, but the definitive loss of the trust of someone who had loved him like a brother. For Hook, that episode was another nail in the coffin of his career. If he couldn't even sustain the trust of those who had known him since childhood, how was he going to sustain the trust of an NBA team? What broke at that camp wasn't balls or jerseys, it was the idea that there was still a possible future for him in professional basketball. In 1999, luck finally turned its back on him. Hook was arrested for an armed robbery at a Blockbuster. He was 31 years old and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The kid who had once been called the next phenomenon from Oakland officially became just another inmate in the California prison system. But even there, among gray walls and watchtowers, his story became different because prison was, for Hook, a new stage, distorted, where he once again found a strange kind of order. During that time, he converted to Islam, adopted a new name, and began to seek a spirituality he had never had in his childhood. It was as if for the first time he was trying to rebuild himself from within. And in parallel, he leaned again on the only thing that had ever saved him, the ball. In the prison yards, Hook became the absolute star. The games were fierce, with inmates playing as if their lives depended on it. And in that hostile environment, he shone again. He jumped over other prisoners, threw down spectacular dunks, and his name spread like wildfire among guards, inmates, and even journalists who began to hear about him. In fact, several images from those years ended up becoming part of the documentary Hook, The Legend of Demetrius Mitchell, released in 2003. In the film, he was shown training in the cell blocks, reflecting on his life and proving that even in prison, he could be a showman. It was surreal. A player many believed destined for the NBA was becoming a legend behind bars. On those concrete courts, Hook was the closest thing to an NBA player those inmates would ever see. He dominated every game as if they were the finals. The same moves that a crowd had once celebrated in Oakland now appeared before a reduced audience of prisoners and guards. It was the ultimate irony. He had reached his peak, but in the worst possible setting. For many, that was where the tragedy of his life crystallized, because Hook did have a league where he dominated. It wasn't the NBA, it was prison, and that brutal contrast turned him into something bigger than just a player. It transformed him into an urban myth. Hook was released from prison in April 2004. He was 35 years old, his body battered by excesses, but he still had the spark that had made him famous in Oakland. And for a moment, it seemed like life was giving him one last chance. The Golden State Warriors invited him to their training camp, a gesture seen almost as an act of faith, the possibility that this street legend could finally prove himself on an NBA stage. The news spread like wildfire. For many in Oakland, seeing Hook in a Warriors jersey was unthinkable, almost a dream come true. He had survived the streets, the drugs, and prison, and there he was, on a professional court, training alongside real players, but the illusion didn't last long. Hook didn't have the physical preparation or discipline to keep up. The Warriors let him go before he could make his debut. Still, not everything was lost. He landed a contract with Reebok, which bet on his name as an icon of street culture. He did a few photo shoots, appeared at events, and for the first time in a long while, Hook seemed to have a path outside the chaos. The brand marketed him as the playground legend, the man who could dunk over anyone despite being 1.75 meters tall. It wasn't the NBA, but it was recognition, money, and visibility. However, the shadow of his past wouldn't let go. Hook fell back into the same circles, the same temptations that had sunk him before: fast fame, easy money, bad company. It didn't take long for him to relapse and return to prison. And that return was devastating because he was no longer the kid with wasted potential, but an adult who had had another chance and thrown it away. That second fall sealed his fate. The NBA dream was no longer possible. What remained was the echo of what could have been. Every now and then, his name appeared in documentaries, magazine articles, in rankings of the best who never played in the league. But the reality was different. Hook had held the ball in his hands, the spotlight on him, and yet it slipped away. The hardest part is that even after getting out of prison a second time, he still had admirers. Kids from Oakland looked up to him as a role model, called him coach, invited him to street tournaments. To them, he was still a hero, but no longer a hero aspiring to stardom. He was a fallen hero with broken wings, walking among the ruins of what his talent had once been. Although he never officially wore an NBA jersey, the name Demetrius Hook Mitchell remains etched in basketball memory. Not for titles or statistics, but for the paradox of his life. The man who had everything to succeed and yet stayed at the doorstep. His figure began to take on another dimension thanks to documentaries. In 2003, while still in prison, Hook, the legend of Demetrius Mitchell, was released. There he was, reflecting behind bars, training in prison yards, speaking with a mix of resignation and hope. It was a raw portrait, talent intact but caged. For many, it was the first time they heard his full story, and the feeling was clear. The NBA had missed out on a giant. Years later, in 2012, he appeared in The Town Game, Two Lives, Two Paths, sharing the screen with Leon Powell, another Oakland player who did make it to the NBA. The contrast was brutal. Two paths that had started in the same place with the same love for basketball, but ending in completely opposite destinies. Additionally, specialized magazines like Complex included him in their rankings of the best players who never stepped on an NBA court, placing him 11th on a list of 20 historic names. A symbolic recognition, but one that reinforced the idea that despite everything, Hook had left his mark. Off the screen, he also reinvented himself as a figure in street culture. He founded the Oakland Mountain Dew Extreme Team, a youth program that combined basketball with community activities, and he began to be seen as an AAU coach in California. In parallel, he participated in mixtape tournaments, those urban basketball showcases where technique merges with showmanship. For the younger generation, Hook was a bridge between two worlds, the wild playgrounds of the 80s and 90s and the hip-hop culture surrounding street basketball in the modern era. His legacy ultimately was never the NBA, but the myth. Oakland still remembers him as a king of the streets, a symbol of untamed talent. And on every neighborhood court, every time a 1.70-meter kid dreams of dunking over someone much taller, Hook's name appears as an inspiration impossible to erase. A living ghost, someone who was one step from heaven, fell into hell, and yet has never stopped being remembered as one of the greatest who never played in the league. And perhaps the real question isn't how much the NBA lost without Hook. The story of Demetrius Hook Mitchell isn't that of a player who failed in silence, but of a myth that makes people uncomfortable. Because every time someone mentions his name, the inevitable question arises, what would have happened if he had the same discipline as Gary Payton or the same guidance as Jason Kidd? How many rings, how many epic nights in the NBA did we miss out on? Hook never stopped being a spectacle, but his stage wasn't Madison Square Garden or the Staples Center. It was the playgrounds of Oakland and the prison courts, places with no HD cameras or million-dollar contracts, but that hold in collective memory the feats of a man who soared above everyone. His legacy is uncomfortable because it can't be reduced to a simple moral. It's not wasted talent or a tale of redemption. It's something much more complex. It's a reminder that talent alone is not enough, and that even the chosen can sink if their environment environment and choices drag them down. Hook still walks the streets of Oakland, appears at events, talks to young people. He is no longer the kid everyone expected to see in the NBA, but he's not just a memory either. He is a reminder, not of how much we lost, but of how much he himself lost, knowing that his own shadow always played against him. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.